Alright, it's time for another album throwdown, and this time we've got two metal masterpieces. In one corner we've got Black Sabbath's classic album Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, and in the other corner we've got Metallica's classic album Master of Puppets. Alright, let's start off with talking about Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. This album was recorded in September of 1973, and it was released in November of 1973. And one of the interesting facts about it is that the band recorded it at this location called Clearwell Castle, and they actually went down into the dungeon of this castle for inspiration. And it seems to have really paid off because, as I've been quoted as saying in the past, the first 5 Black Sabbath albums are all masterpieces. And this one may be fighting really hard with the first one as to which one is actually the best out of those 5. So on side 1, you've got just an incredible song selection, starting with Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, then a National Acrobat. There's an instrumental called Fluff, and then there's like a bluesy, almost throwback to their roots song called Sabra Cadabra. And not only is there a great range on this side of the album, there's a urgency to it, almost like there's so much the band has to say that they have to cover all of these different musical styles for a reason. They're not just doing it for kicks, they're doing it because that's part of the statement that they want to make. Alright, so going on to side B, we start to get really experimental for Sabbath. And while this is an album that's in the middle of their catalog, rather than summing up the past, it's actually a forward-looking collection of songs. And Killing Yourself to Live is a really good example of that. Because for Sabbath, this is almost a ballad. I mean, it's poppy, it's up-tempo, and it has a reflective lyric to it. And it has a really smooth production over the top of it. Now when you get to the song Who Are You, we're drenched in synthesizers, and we're talking 1970s synthesizers. So the mix and the production on these was all like a new frontier at the time. This is an Ozzy, a heavily Ozzy song, and the vocal melody and the synth is entirely original as far as you can tell. You can go back and dig around out there. You might find some horror movie soundtracks or something that resemble it, or some really far out jazz music. But it's incredibly original piece of music. Now, side 2 finishes with what might be one of the best songs on the album, which is called Spiral Architect. And here Sabbath attains like a majesty, like an ability to do songs that are on the level of classical music, but they don't really sound like classical music. The thing about this album is it's so hard hitting, but it comes from the very soul of the band. That they seem to be playing and composing at their very highest levels. Alright, moving on to Master of Puppets. It was recorded from September to December in 1985 and released in March of 1986. It was the band's 3rd album, and it was produced by Flemming Rasmussen, but there's got to be an asterisk there, which is there's not a lot of production on this album. That's part of what it's all about. There is some, but this album could have been recorded straight into a board somewhere, or even live under optimum recording conditions, all with the band in one room, and had not much done to it, and it wouldn't sound terribly different than it does. In other words, the songs, the band, and the arrangements are where Metallica wants the expression to come from, not from the production on this particular album. And that wouldn't happen really until they got to the Black Album. Alright, so one thing about this album that flies under a lot of people's radar is that it's actually a concept album. Every single song on this album is about power or the abuse of power. So when you start off with Battery, it's about family, domestic violence, and Master of Puppets is about drug addiction and drug abuse, and The Thing That Should Not Be is about cult or cosmic, magical, dark black magic abuse, and Welcome Home Sanitarium is about psychiatric abuse. And on side 2, Disposable Heroes is about military abuse. Leper Messiah is about religious abuse. And Damage Incorporated is about violent abuse in any form. Now, that left out one song, Orion. And that's because this song is part of the concept album, and it's about the theme of abusive power, but it's not an abusive power. It's a balance song. It's a song about a balancing of power. So you could read that as Orion the hunter, and the hunter in the hunt is a sacred act that keeps humanity in balance with the forces of nature. So that's the contrast song to the rest of the songs that show that there's an abusive power. And so you could conclude from that the reason that all of the other forms of power are abusive is because they're not in harmony with nature. And so there is a strong unified statement to the album. Do I think Metallica sat around and hashed this all out and thought about it all that way like I just said? Probably not. It's one of those things about how when you're doing creative things, they take on a momentum of their own and they just sort of bring their own forces together this way. So I think that whether they, sat down and intellectualized or whether it just came together that way, it's what you might call a sleeper concept album. Now, let's move on and talk a little bit about the musicianship on here. Whereas Black Sabbath was reaching out to new experimentation and trying to find sounds they hadn't done before and things that no one would expect them to do, this album is definitely a summing up of the albums that went before it. It's an attempt to get mastery over what they had been doing. It's a demonstration of what they'd learned about themselves. And as such, it's really solid from track to track. It's got very few weak points on it, and if any, to be honest. And so whether you're talking about the riffs, the lyrics, or the band sound together, you have to kind of think it's a 10 all the way across, which makes it really difficult to choose one of these albums over the other. But I guess I have to. And if I have to choose one over the other, I'm going to go with Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. And the reason that I'm going to go with Sabbath Bloody Sabbath is just because it has so much more of a dynamic range of materials, has so much more of a reaching for newness and experimentation. And a lot of times that can be a bad thing, but in this particular case it worked out really well, and so just by a nudge, I'll give it to Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. But what really matters is what you think. So if you have a comment on this or any other topic connected to classic or contemporary music, please leave it in the section below, and remember to like and subscribe. Thanks a lot.